Here in Massachusetts, October and November are welcomed and eagerly celebrated. Halloween in particular is something almost every masshole, from Stockbridge to Boston, enthusiastically celebrates all month long. Tourist trips up to Salem, everyone putting out spooky decorations, and all the haunted houses and hayrides. We love fall, and in particular, the spooky and occult, and not just here, but across the globe as well. It's no wonder that so many are fascinated with the shadowy, undead side of Warcraft. When Warcraft 3 launched, one of the things that people were blown away by was the Scourge faction, and all the new creatures and necromantic creations that made up the Undead Legions. Many were infatuated with the forces of death, but the history of necromancy in Warcraft reaches long before the Lich King's first invasion of the Eastern Kingdoms. Welcome to Ancient Lore, a discussion series where we peel back the layers of world building and story to examine, understand, and discuss where we came from in the World of Warcraft. Today's topic is the history of necromancy, from necrolytes to Ner'zhul, and as always, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section below, or connect with me on my Discord. Our parameters are pretty simple on this one. We'll be starting with the details from the original Warcraft and covering tidbits from each title one by one. We don't need to concern ourselves too much with the books or comics, but I am discounting anything post-Wrath, especially the later Sylvanas and Shadowlands storylines, as they're honestly terrible writing, and Sylvanas deserved so much better than it. Also, anything with Setael and the first Necrolyte is a complete write-off, as it's ridiculously inconsistent and poorly written. With that being said, let's dig into the first documented instances of necromancy. Before and during the first invasion on behalf of the Orcish hordes, necrolytes are described as the spiritual leaders of the Orc clans. They connected with the unholy powers of the earth and the souls of hell to empower the clans and raise the dead into service once again. We can, from this description, assume that as shamanism was purged from Orcish culture, necrolytes were introduced as a pale imitation, functioning in a similar role using the powers of shadow and death without any legitimate connection to the elements. With the magic of darkness at their command, they emboldened the horde onward, speaking words of power and death. From the few details of individual necrolytes we can scrap together, most of which come from Terran Gorefiend, they were not reasonable or kind religious leaders. Most would be described as cruel and sadistic, eager practitioners of the most egregious death magics. While Gorefiend was clearly documented as the most vile of all of them, we do have a very limited idea of the Necrolyte order in general. To quote from the Warcraft 1 manual, necrolytes have power over all things dark and evil. Through ceremonies performed at their temple, they learn to warp the essence of shadow. Cruelty was very much baked into their purpose in the Horde. While powerful, the necrolytes couldn't stop fate itself. With Doomhammer's slaughter of the warlocks after Warcraft 1 and the subjugation of Gul'dan, the chief warlock was instructed to find a way to provide magical support for the Horde's armies as they moved north. His brilliant scheme? Bring all the necrolytes together, have them ritualistically sacrifice themselves, and then shove their souls into the corpses of Death Knights of Stormwind. Shockingly, because of his attunement to fell magic and knowledge of necromancy, this worked, making the first iteration of the beings known as Death Knights. These somewhat frail and gaunt-looking necromantic beings weren't able to hold up in a direct fight one-on-one, but when able to support other fighters with their potent dark spellcasting, made an immense difference in almost any battle. This new kind of existence that the Death Knights represented, sacrificed souls contained in dead bodies and reanimated, represented a potent opportunity to research new forms of necromantic magics. Spells like Death and Decay and Death Coil were conjured by this new group of spellcasters and represented a more concentrated form of undead power compared to the more traditional necromancers that necrolytes represented. Led by the previously mentioned Terran Gorefiend, the Death Knights eagerly marched in support of the Horde during the Second War. When the fight turned on the Horde, they ended up retreating back through the Dark Portal and aligning themselves with the leadership of the Shadowmoon clan chieftain Ner'zhul, a master of the shadow arts and a powerful orc spellcaster in his own right. Hoping that by standing alongside the Shadowmoon, the Death Knights would be able to find a home for themselves, thanks to a plan Gorfin concocted and shared with Ner'zhul. Unfortunately, during the Alliance and Horde's back-and-forth incursions through the Dark Portal during the events of, oddly titled, Beyond the Dark Portal expansion for Warcraft 2, almost all Death Knights were obliterated, whether in combat with the Alliance forces, bloody Horde internal conflicts, or after Ner'zhul opened the rifts. Nearly all these original Death Knights were destroyed, their physical bodies too frail and deteriorated to last. This end to Beyond the Dark Portal is vital, however, and begins the series of events that leads to the Scourging of Lordaeron and the power of death having its greatest surge across Azeroth. Gorfin's grand scheme that he shared with Ner'zhul was, instead of just having one rift, which went to Azeroth, open dozens of them, giving the Horde nearly limitless worlds to plunder throughout space. One problem. Traveling through the rifts meant traveling through the twisting nether, where the Burning Legion easily and quickly ambushed the Old Orc and his followers. Only Ner'zhul was allowed to survive, and was tortured for long enough that his mind was shattered. Broken, maddened, and unable to deny the will of the Legion, Kil'jaeden ripped the Orc soul from his maligned form and fused it into a set of horrific armor and runeblade, placing it deep in Northrend in a giant slab of diamond-hard ice, and thus the Lich King was born. The coming of the Scourge, as I mentioned early on in this episode, was tantalizing in so many ways for Warcraft players. The introduction of so many new creatures, spells, items, and powers captured the attention of many of us, and for good reason. Before Arthas even began his march from Strombrad to Stratholme, however, Ner'zhul had been whispering to those eager to delve into the occult across the Northern Kingdoms. Everyone from powerful spellcasters like the mage Kel'Thuzad to everyday downtrodden peasants could have been tempted at one point to embrace the darker arts. Dalaran and their Council of Six had, since time immemorial, banned necromantic and fell magics, thus requiring those tempted by the whispers of the Lich King to practice their foul spells in private, forming covens of cultists dedicated to the worship of death. Ner'zhul nudged these early Cult of the Damned members towards forbidden knowledge, making certain they were learning and developing their powers in the way he saw fit. We saw many developments from this time period. To start, a few units on the roster for the Scourge was due to this experimentation and learning process. The corpse carts, assembled to preserve and deliver, sometimes explosively, corpses, was essential to the evolution of the Scourge, and a key plot point early on in the Scourge campaign. The abomination, an amalgamation of corpses stitched together, was one of the most horrifying creations the Cult of the Damned ever imagined, and became a staple of the undead hordes. Necromancers themselves also became a vital part of the Scourge unit roster, a supporting spellcaster capable of unholy haste and raising the dead in service of the Lich King. Not all cult members were as magically inclined. Some were unscrupulous and strong-willed individuals who, for the most part, were incredibly capable warriors. These betrayers of humanity had great potential in the eyes of the Lich King, and were gifted necromantic powers as well as blades inscribed with unholy runes of death. These individuals became the second round of Death Knights, with the fallen Prince Arthas being chief amongst them. These Death Knights had less of a focus on pure spellcasting prowess compared to the admittedly unrelated first iteration of their order, choosing instead to embrace a balanced martial and magic approach. Their rune blades were deadly when in the right hands, and their control of death magic enabled them to purge life, raise the dead en masse, and use their unnatural powers to regenerate flesh of allies around them. They were devastating and impressive leaders of the Scourge at large, extension of the Lich King's will. Truly dedicated and exceptionally powerful spellcasters in the Cult of the Damned were also rewarded for their efforts, transfigured into eternal liches, their souls damned to return to this world even when their physical forms were destroyed over and over again. These magic users of the highest order embraced the frozen winds of Northrend as their power, slinging frostbolts and novas at will. They were also taught a few of the forbidden secrets of the original Order of Death Knights, the power of death and decay in particular, in rejection of everything they stood for as former mages of Dalaran. In general, the Cult of the Damned, bolstered by the Lich King's will, made incredible advancements in the areas of long-term necromancy. The Scourge and many of its undead soldiers were made of corpses or long-dead creatures, Nerubians, gargoyles, and frostworms, for example. In the past, necromantic constructs had very limited durations and were easily dispelled by holy or arcane magics, with the exception of the original Death Knights, although they were incredibly frail and none survived more than a few years. Scourge creatures, however, no longer had this vulnerability and existed as permanent undead creatures in the world. This is unfortunately never expounded upon, and very much could have been a point the game writers glazed over, although one could easily speculate that outside the Scourge's area of influence, think the Blight mechanic in Warcraft 3, they may start to break down eventually. All in all, Warcraft 3's Scourge faction gave us so much to learn and speculate on in regards to the powers of death. It really was a treasure trove of new world building that led to some of the greatest moments in the history of Warcraft at large. It doesn't end there either. After the invasion of Lordaeron and the failed onslaught on the part of the Burning Legion, the Lich King demanded a new generation of Death Knights to help conquer the world. This third iteration of Death Knights, trained by the second, is where the player character Death Knights came into play during the opening to Wrath of the Lich King. The Ebon Blade, as they called themselves after they broke away from the Scourge, was a major advancement in how the Lich King empowered even non-magically adept dead into service. Using stronger runes that could be inscribed by the Death Knight onto any weapon, this gave the new Masters of Death impressive flexibility and strength. They were also instructed in the ways of greater spellcasting, not only able to raise the dead en masse like the previous generation of Death Knights, but also able to summon the dead to serve them in the long term. And they had the ability to sling deadly diseases alongside acts of more powerful spellcraft, such as Death and Decay. The art of necromancy, death magic in general, has evolved over the course of the games, from vague references to unholy earth spirits to the refined creation and exacting control of the Scourge's undead armies. We see a few interesting consistencies between them. The first is that much like the dark side in Star Wars, necromancy and death magic has a physically corrupting influence, and much like fel magic, actively purges life from areas that it's used in. The next is, in every example of users of death magics, there's a very serious streak of sadism and an almost total lack of empathy. They care nothing for the existence of others, only their own power and experimentation. Lastly, there is a physical frailness that comes with the embracing of death magic or being the kind of undead construct that uses it, and the use of unholy regeneration, reinforcement of the physical form through bolts, stitching, and wire, or other means to counteract this frailty is vital. There's more to explore on this topic, specifically with the question of where is the overlap between necromancy and shadow magic, and what are the implications of the two interacting. Most would consider them to be the same thing, but with the old gods, it's clear that even though they're both based on the same or similar substances, the results of each are very different. One is of the dead, the other is of the mind. In addition, one thing that I think isn't explored nearly as well is how diseases and plagues are developed. Blizzard takes a very Warhammer approach to them, placing cauldrons around an area and saying, "Okay, this is where the plagues are coming from, good luck." Obviously, this is in reference to the undead plague that ravaged Lordaeron and helped birth the Scourge. But this doesn't tell us anything about how the plague was created, or how the Ebon Blade developed their new diseases that they used to slaughter their foes. Nevertheless, what we see in the evolution of the power of death through the RTS games and in World of Warcraft is nothing less than fascinating, and I always enjoy exploring it in detail. In a future episode, we'll take a look at the other schools of magic, and in particular the arcane, its sources, and how a single school of magic can be used to create such a wide array of different effects, spells, and disciplines. Look forward to a detailed look of how World of Warcraft so effectively created different disciplines and mentalities for the different schools of magic, something I enjoy speaking on as someone who played a fire mage for so long. We close this book of Warcraft history here and save the rest for another time. If you've enjoyed this feature, please consider subscribing here at youtube.com/thedannation, as well as joining my Discord at tinyurl.com/danscord. It's a Discord, but with 100% more Dan. A big thank you to Turtle Wow for most of the visual footage you see during this episode was recorded at, as well as having provided the backing track for this piece. In addition, thank you to those who signed up for memberships here on YouTube. Your financial support is greatly appreciated. From the Lore Bunker here in Boston, Massachusetts, happy Halloween. This is Dan wishing you a wonderful and wide world of lore.